Welcome. My name's John Bandler. We are answering your questions on my Cyberlaw book and on Cyberlaw. These pertain mostly to Part 7, International Cyber Actions and Cyber Conflict, and that part only has one chapter in it on international cyber conflict and law. It just didn't fit within another part, so I have a couple of these parts that only have one chapter in them. Law's all around us. It's for everyone. Cyber's all around us. That's for everyone too. That means cyber law is for everyone. I wrote this course book to teach from. It's the perfect book for me, and others may teach with the book too, and others have questions on cyber law or are reading the book. These are quick and off the cuff. It's not a polished slide deck. I like when students ask genuine questions, and in my courses, I solicit those questions. My book is broken into parts. It gives you a foundation in law, it gives you a foundation in cyber, and then we dive into areas of cyber law. This video is questions relating to Part 7 of the book. Don't forget the chapter resource pages, and there is a chapter resource page for every chapter, including 35. And here's some disclaimers. It's rapid fire, off the cuff answers. I may make mistakes about the facts or the law, and it contains personal opinion. Sometimes students ask for it, sometimes I just give it. Here's the first question. What do you think would be a great first job in this field of study with only experience from courses taken in grad school? This is a question that seems to be asked almost every week, and I'm happy to answer it again. And by this field of study, not sure, maybe you mean cyber law. And if you're studying cyber law, that's relevant for any job relating to technology, and you're in a graduate program involving technology, information systems, information security, cyber security. It would be hard to advance in any of those fields without having a good foundation in cyber law, which this course is about. Of course, if you're interested in becoming a lawyer, it's important to know something about cyber law. If you're interested in running a business or managing or being an executive in any type of business, you need to know something about cyber law. And don't forget this video I created, tips for a career in cyber. But also, even if your career is not in cyber, remember, law is for everyone. Cyber is for everyone, and if you're going to college or graduate school or other higher learning, remember to focus on those learning principles I talk about in other videos. You need to build your skills. You need to know how to research and investigate, to read, think, write, edit, present. You also need to build your knowledge in diverse areas, including law, but also all kinds of other areas. And you need to network, you need to investigate, you need to research companies and jobs. Sometimes certifications help professional memberships, but that personal networking and getting to know people and what fields they're in to see if it's right for you, and to find that lead to get that internship or that job. Because we're living in an era now where job applicants are using AI to create resumes and send it to 1,000 places, and then companies are using AI to try sift through that mountain of stuff. So that personal connection and the personal skills are going to be important. So check out that video. Next question, since the Tallinn manual is not binding law, what practical mechanism, if any, exists to compel a nation state to treat a significant cyber attack on critical infrastructure as an armed attack, justifying a military response under Article 51? I'm going to edit this question or just address this word compel. In law, there's nothing that ever compels a nation state to do something or treat an attack a certain way. In international law, there isn't, and actually in domestic law, there isn't either. It's not about compelling the victim or the government to do something. The law gives the government legal justification to do something. The question is, does the nation state choose to treat it as an armed attack? Do they choose to respond? And can they justify their response under international law? If it was a significant cyber attack that caused death and destruction, the nation state may choose to say, this is an armed attack, and that is why we are choosing to respond this way, and that is why our response is justified under international law. Now, with that said, the Tallinn Manual may not be law, but it's highly persuasive about what the law is. The Tallinn Manual represents all of this legal brain power to discuss and explain what the international law is surrounding cyber conflict. So if a nation state was responding to a cyber attack with kinetic force, they would point to the Tallinn Manual as highly persuasive to justify their action. And then this leads into something else, which is even when you have clear binding laws in the international arena, we need to realize how difficult it is to enforce those laws. I mean, these are the hardest laws to enforce practically, right? If you've ever driven on the highway, you know that a lot of people speed. Enforcing the speeding laws is actually pretty hard to do, but it's the simplest form of prosecution that exists. Cop stops someone, gives them a ticket, have to show up in court. Mechanisms if they don't show up in court. That's the simplest prosecution process there is. And then on the other continuum, as the most difficult law to enforce are all these international laws. So it just helps to put that into perspective, and it ties into the next question. If you had to design one new international rule specifically for cyber warfare, what would it be and why? For example, would you focus on protecting critical infrastructure like hospitals and power grids, or creating stricter consequences for countries that spread misinformation? It's interesting to think about how just one well-designed rule could potentially reduce a lot of harm in future conflicts. And to continue my prior thought, I think we all need to step back from thinking that a new law fixes things. And that's a running theme in the book, whatever the area of law. So we want to appreciate law and appreciate the importance and necessity of it, the importance of having people who understand law, create good, reasonable laws, who follow laws, who want laws to be properly and fairly enforced, whatever the type of law. But we also have to realize the practicalities of the world we live in, especially in the international arena. You can create a new substantive law, but that doesn't mean people comply with this. And we have this discussion with cybercrime too. You could create a new cybercrime law or a much bigger penalty for a cybercrime, but that doesn't mean the cybercrime stops or slows. You have to reasonably enforce it. You have to catch some cybercriminals. With international law, you can create a new international law, but that doesn't mean every nation is going to comply with it. If you have a country willing to invade another country or commit atrocities, it doesn't matter how many new international laws you create. It doesn't mean they're going to comply with it. It doesn't mean you'll be able to enforce it easily. Example, Russia. Russia's been committing violations in cyberspace, and they invaded Ukraine, and they've committed crimes and war crimes in Ukraine. If you create a new cyber law, I doubt Russia's going to comply with it because they're not complying with the other laws, and that's one example. And to look at what Ukraine has to do to enforce their rights to sovereignty against an invasion. It's not bringing a legal action in a criminal court. This is a full-scale war. Next question. This topic was interesting. If a cyber operation shuts down a country's power grid for several days but no one is physically killed, do you think it should be treated more like a criminal act or an act of war, and why? Of course, it's hard to say based on, the country would need to know the totality, and that's why the book talks about that range of actions that the country could take. They might do a criminal investigation and prosecution. They might do covert actions. They clearly would do covert actions. Would they treat it as an act of war to justify an armed response? They might look to see what that would do. So I think a country would look to all of their options and how they could be justified and what might be most effective. And we would want to look to the actual harm. So I think this question might underestimate the effects of a power grid being down for several days. I do think you would see a number of deaths and a bit of damage if an entire country's power grid was down for several days. Now, I don't know the numbers. I know there are people studying that. You would hope our country is studying that so we can evaluate how to protect and mitigate against that. I would think it would be at least dozens of deaths, maybe hundreds, maybe thousands of deaths, but people would die. And I don't know the amount of damage to property or the monetary losses to try to evaluate the scale of the destruction, but it would easily be in the millions of dollars, probably billions of dollars, and maybe many billions of dollars. When you look at the deaths and the destruction and the damage, then you would look to see, is this tantamount to an armed attack, and how it would relate to traditional law on traditional military force. And you'd look to things like the Tallinn Manual, and I don't profess to be an expert on the Tallinn Manual, but it may well address this situation. So if a missile attack on a building would cause dozens or hundreds of deaths, and a power outage in an entire country, and I think it would be hard because our grid is interrelated, there's not one unifying control to hack, but let's say they could take out the entire grid. I think you're looking at hundreds of deaths and billions of dollars of damage, so then you would do that analysis. All right, question. As I engaged with the questions and all other readings, question came to mind relate to modern conflicts where nations are increasingly relying on digital tools such as location tracking applications, satellite mapping, internet surveillance, hacking capabilities during armed conflict. Curious whether the use of tools like Find My Location technology, mapping platforms, cyber surveillance, or hacking communication networks could violate principles of jus in bello if they result in the targeting of civilians or civilian infrastructure. For example, if such technologies are used to locate civilians rather than military targets, would that violate the principles of distinction and proportionality under international humanitarian law? Further to this question is whether service providers of such technologies can be found complicit or equally liable in the event that the users are found guilty. Can they be considered accomplices in a sense? And I guess first, just a reminder, international law and international conflict is a different area of law from criminal law. So sometimes some of those terms that we might use for one, like accomplices or found guilty, might not make sense in the context of international conflict law. There can be some overlap because a country could choose international type options and criminal prosecution. And I think we want to make a distinction between the intelligence gathering and the targeting. So intelligence gathering is going on all the time, and that will relate to things like location tracking and those Find My tools. So if military personnel or leaders of a country are using those tools, rest assured that adverse nation states are looking for ways to tap into that to track people. And that can be very valuable for intelligence gathering, for espionage, and yes, also for targeting. Now, just because you track and gather the intelligence doesn't mean you target and kill. But once you start targeting and trying to kill, then you need to think whether it's justified, and you'd look, is it justified under the laws of war, jus in bello. So if you're using all that intelligence gathering and then you target a combatant, and you have that legal justification to kill under international law, then that would be what nations normally do. You get intelligence, you target, you try to kill them, you kill them. but obviously it gets murky. If you're targeting a military personnel and you tracked him to his home where he lives or she lives with their family, and then you target and kill them there, are they a combatant? Their family is certainly not a combatant, and it obviously gets much more murky. Are you targeting heads of the military? Are you targeting heads of government? That gets more murky because generally assassination is frowned upon. You're targeting scientists? That gets murky too. Are they civilians? Are they combatants? Are they civilian scientists creating knowledge, technology, engineering to create a lethal tool, to create an illegal tool? It certainly gets pretty murky, doesn't it? It may be a little off topic because this chapter had to do more so with UN, but do you believe that NATO has violated any of these rules set by the UN? Or have they always operated in a rule-abiding manner? Now, I would say this chapter is focused on all law relating to international cyber conflict. Definitely includes the UN Charter and the role of the UN, but I would say lots more than that. And not just the law, but the practicalities of these international cyber conflicts. So the question's asking if NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, has ever violated rules of the UN, and maybe it means rules of international conflict. And then I guess it's asking, have member nations of NATO ever violated the rules? Maybe it's going there. And it's also kind of going, the United States has always been, since World War II, a superpower, a dominant force in NATO. So it's also kind of asking, has the U.S. ever violated these rules? And I think it's important to start by saying it's hard to find a perfect nation. There's no perfect nation. There's no organization of nations that has operated perfectly and made perfect decisions throughout their history. And I'm not a military historian, and opinions vary. A lot of people agree with a lot of past military actions. A lot of people disagree with a lot of them or disagree with some. I also think it's important that we not do whataboutism, because sometimes people say, oh, so what if Russia invaded Ukraine? The U.S. has done bad things in the past before. So we don't want to do whataboutism, but we do want to objectively, reasonably analyze actions, including present ones, and which the next question gets to, but including in the past, to discuss honestly, hey, how is this justified under the laws of war? And then whether the war, armed attack or armed response was justified or not, we also want to ask, was this reasonable? Was it good for the country? Was it good for the world we live in? So those are all important things to discuss. Now, I don't want to dodge the question either. So I do think that up until the last couple years, the U.S. and NATO have generally been trying to do the right thing and generally doing the right thing. I always viewed this country as the shining country on the hill. It's made lots of mistakes. Not going to defend everything and say it was always perfect, but I think in general, up until the last couple years, this country has been a protector of freedoms, human rights, democracy, free speech around the world, and protected a lot of countries around the world. And that's my general opinion about how the U.S. and NATO has been in the past. And the next question asks about the Iran war. Question, do you think any laws were violated in the current conflict the U.S. is involved in the Middle East? And let's call that the Iran war. And even the president calls it a war. Although sometimes he says it's not a war, let's call it the Iran war. And no war's been declared. It's the Constitution says Congress has the power to declare war. We've also got this War Powers Act, which allows the president to do certain things with a certain time limit of 60 days or so. But before we talk about laws, I want to talk to good judgment and what's good for the country and what's good for the world. That's not laws, but I think it's important. And I think that principles of good judgment were violated. Doesn't mean a law was violated. I'll get to that in a sec. But before a country or the U.S. does military action, normally you want to get support. You want to get support from allied nations. You want to get support from the UN, the world community. You're never going to get 100% support from all the nations, but you kind of want a consensus. And you can disagree with the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. You can disagree with the premise of it, but we can all agree that the U.S. sought and obtained support from the UN, allied nations, NATO, Congress, the American people. Not 100% of them, but a good swath of them, probably more than a majority. And none of that was done here. There was no attempt to get support from allied nations or the UN or from Congress or from the American people. They just did it. And I think that's a bad decision. The next thing is, how do you justify it under the law? And I would say they did not work hard to justify it. And what they said was very, what's called conclusory, without facts, without details, requiring leaps of faith. And I don't think they justified it. And they put out something more recently that I do not think justifies it. And I think a lot of respected scholars in the area of military law and international conflict, international law, have come out to say it's not justified. A lot have resigned or left their positions in government-related institutions because their opinion differs so much. I think the U.S. government has made statements that are in of themselves are unlawful. So a threat to attack civilian infrastructure, a threat to end a civilization, the threat in and of itself, I believe, is not lawful. And then there are actions that are arguably not lawful, attacks, specific military attacks. And then you add that into these drug boat strikes where our military is using deadly force and killing alleged drug traffickers coming by boat, which a lot of scholars say is illegal. And you add all of that up, and it is hard to give the current U.S. executive branch the benefit of the doubt. We don't have allied support. And then we need to look at the other practical effects of this war, these attacks, whatever you want to call it, for the next months, years, and decades, creating a situation that we're going to have to live with for decades. Last question. This was an interesting chapter and very insightful. I also think it is relevant, especially now given how prominent social media is in creating a divide amongst people in the United States and how nation-state actors will utilize the cyberspace to spread their agenda. Have you seen any instances on social media where you think it could potentially be nation-state actors trying to cause divide in the United States? Well, yes, and the book talks about this, right? And it's happened and been documented. The 2016 election, the Mueller report, every subsequent election. So the book references cases in the three presidential elections since then, 2016, 2020, 2024. And it's not just the elections, obviously. It's happening every minute, every day, every month, every year. And it's not just social media. It's all other areas of online influence. It includes AI tools now. And we have to think about AI tools and what they've done to humans. Humans less able to read a chapter, read an article, read a book. Humans more reliant on social media, quick snippets to get their information and opinion. More reliant on AI summaries to get their facts and opinion and slant. And it's scarier now because humans are more susceptible to influence, less able to focus, less able to analyze and think, discern fact from fiction, logic from rage bait. And that's why the next chapter is about the battle for our minds, which is kind of the culmination of what we've learned with First Amendment, AI, privacy, and international conflict. So I hope you like this next chapter. Okay, so thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Comment if you have a question for me to ask. If I answered your question, let your professor know. so they know you watch this. And find another way to let your professor know you watch this all the way through. Remember, laws for everyone, cyber laws for everyone too. I love answering genuine questions. Links in the description. Lots of ways to learn more about cyber law. See the description. See my references page. Remember, these are my off-the-cuff answers to student questions. Thank you. Take care.